If you ever wondered why you can walk in a straight line with your eyes closed with no problem, or if you ever wondered how could someone play guitar with eye closed, or how would someone touch a tip of nose with eye closed? Well, behind these smooth movements lies a little but yet very important part of the brain, which is called cerebellum. So, uh, welcome as we're going to uncover the secrets behind cerebellum. So by the end of this video, you not only understand the anatomical layout of the cerebellum, but you also be able to, maintain your balance and coordinate your movement with no problems. So here's the breakdown on how we're gonna go about. So we'll see the external features of the cerebellum. We will dive into the internal anatomy whereby we also see the connection, different connection within the cerebellum, the input connection, the output, as well as the intrinsic connection within the cerebellum, how like information pass from one point of cerebellum into another. But as the part of clinical anatomy, we will discuss about ataxia and dysdeudokinesia, the very, 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 very important part and very, very, clinical correlation as far as in the neuroanatomy of cerebellum is concerned. But let's ask ourselves, like, do you know what happens when someone has got a lesion in the vermis of the cerebellum? Yes, but at the end of this video, you will also be able to explain these questions. You'll be able to explain what happens when someone has got a lesion on the vermis of the cerebellum. But I'm sure also you will be able to explain, these deep cerebellar nuclei with the, with their function. How are they organized? But the functional division of the cerebellum, which is very, very important, that will help us to explain the clinical anatomy or clinical neuroanatomy of the cerebellum, ataxia, and dysdeudokinesia. We'll be able to explain those clinical neuroanatomy because we will be able to explain the functional divisions of their cerebellum. And lastly, it is the ipsilaterality of the cerebellum. Ipsilaterality of the cerebellum. It is widely known that even lay people know this, that if someone has got a lesion on the right side of the brain, the symptoms or presentation will be on the left side of the body. And if someone has got a lesion on the left side of the brain, the symptoms or presentation will be on the right side of the brain. They are all true, but this is not true for the case of cerebellum, because in cerebellum the lesions will reveal itself. The lesions, if someone has got a lesion in cerebellum, the symptoms will be on the ipsilateral side of the body. So this ipsilaterality will be explained as we're moving along in this video. So let's first see the motor organization of the motor system. The motor system is a complex system. It's not something that has got a simple connection. It is complicated kind of connection, whereby you see we have all these structures that help us in, the help in motor organization. So we have a cerebral cortex here, which is the cerebrum, now the forebrain. So the forebrain, as we can see here, it has got reciprocal connection with the thalamus, the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, and you see the brainstem. But it does not communicate directly with the cerebellum, because we already seen that, the anatomical distribution, like they are not on this, they don't have that kind of, direct connection, but it communicates with the cerebellum, through thalamus and brainstem. Yeah? So, the function of the cerebellum, of the cerebral cortex, the forebrain, is, to give those higher order. It's like, we say, it gives command, it gives motor command. The cerebral cortex decides what kind of movement someone to make. It gives command of a specific kind of movement to be made. And see, the basal ganglia, it is the one that, initiate movement. So it leads, like the codes that were given from the higher cortex, the cerebral cortex. It leads those codes and, generate a specific kind of movement. So it's like it is like the cerebral cortex gives the code, but what it is like a note, the music note. If you are a music person, like with those music notes, someone gives you a note, and then, you read the note, you produce that kind of, music that is being ordered from that person, and it goes in that order. So after this movement, after, the cerebral cortex gives the command, the basal ganglia will initiate the movement, and, the cerebellum will, what will do is to proofread that movement. It compares the sensor, it compares the information that was given by the cerebral cortex with the movement that has been produced by the basal ganglia. So what it does, just proofreading. Okay, did you do something that was ordered by the cerebral cortex? Oh yes, yeah, okay, no problem, okay, we're good. So that's the function of the cerebellum. So that the basal ganglia is to initiate the movement that is wanted, to inhibit the movement that is not wanted, and the cerebellum now will proofread to make sure the movement that was done was the order that was given from the cerebral cortex. But you see, this is a complex, relationship. So in summary, we say in this motor system, the cerebellum does the timing, precision, and accuracy of movement. So it compares the movement that has been done with the information that was given by the higher cerebral cortex. So this is a summary. On, this motor organization. So you see, the cerebral cortex, it deals with higher level voluntary planning, and I want you to note the word voluntary planning, because, those kind of voluntary movement, they will be the command will come from the cerebral cortex. So the higher level of voluntary planning, that is cerebral cortex. And the basal ganglia, as we've said, it embeds the codes that were given by the cerebral cortex, and then it produces the movement that corresponds to the codes that were given, or corresponds to the order that was given by the cerebral cortex. So you see, it will help you select, initiate or inhibit unwanted movement. So it basically do the filtering of the motor plans. What movement to be initiated, what movement to be inhibited. That is done by the basal ganglia. And then cerebellum now, as we have said, it proofreads what has been done with what has been ordered. So it compares the information. It compares the information that was given by the cerebral cortex and the movement that has been executed by the basal ganglia, and it detects the discrepancy. If there are any discrepancy, if it is, it corrects that discrepancy. That's basically the basic function of the cerebellum. And we have we have then brainstem here, and the brainstem in motor organization, I want you to notice this, that it has a lot of functions. You know that the brainstem, we discussed it in previous two sections. It has a lot of nucleus. Yeah, it is also a pathway between, the cerebrum and, lower central nervous system. But in the case of the motor, now what is the motor contribution of the brainstem? So it maintains posture and tone. So it has got inside. It has got this vestibular nuclei. So we have vestibular nuclei that are located in the brainstem that will help in maintaining posture and tone, and coordination of this motor autonomic movement. Autonomic movement is to say, we call them, involuntary movements, and no wonder, because we discussed this involuntary movement, involuntary control, and example of them. Example is when we say about the cardiovascular movements, like the pumping of the heart, the contraction of smooth muscles of the blood vessels that will control the caliber or the diameter of the blood vessels. But respiratory movements, they're all being done by the brainstem. As we said, the brainstem is the very vital, it controls the vital organs of the body. So let's dive now into the anatomy of cerebellum. Now the cerebellum itself. So the cerebellum, the word cerebellum means little brain, because it is Latin. So Latin cerebrum is like brain, and cerebellum is little brain. It's kind of this Latin. I can compare it with Italian, because for example in Italian, flatel or flatel means brother, but if you say fratellino means little brother. So same applies in the in Latin. So cerebrum is brain, cerebellum means little brain. So that's how it is. The name was evolved from the Latin perspective. So you see, the cerebellum is the second largest part of the brain. So it is called the little brain when it is compared little brain when it is compared with cerebrum, and it sits in the posterior cranial fossa, and it is covered by the layer of dura mater, which is known as tentorium cerebelli, because it is a tent like. So tentorium cerebelli, it's what covers the little brain or the cerebellum. So the primary function of cerebellum is to evaluate and to coordinate movement. So we already said that the cerebellum cannot initiate muscular movement, cannot initiate the movements of the muscles. What it does, it justifies, it profiles, so it detects the discrepancy. It detects the discrepancy, because it compares the information that was given by the cerebral cortex with the movement that was initiated by the basal ganglia. So it detects the discrepancy, and it helps us to correct that discrepancy with no problem. So if we have damage to the cerebellum now, we will be able to make movements, but the movements might have some errors. Why? Because the part that was supposed to detect this movement, detect this discrepancy, and counter them is gone, which is cerebellum. Yeah. So that is it. Yeah. So we can say that there are three main functions of the cerebellum, but the very very first function is coordination of movement. So it coordinates the movement. How we've already seen it, like we've already seen how it compares the information from the cerebral cortex with the basal ganglia. So it also help in regulation of balance and posture with collaboration with it regulates the balance and posture with collaboration with the vestibular nuclei, which are found, the vestibular nuclei are found in the brainstem. So it is itself with collaboration with the vestibular nuclei, but also it helps some motor planning with connection or collaboration with the cerebral cortex. So we see this this will form a basis of functional classification. We have two functional classification of the cerebellum. We'll see all of them as we are moving. So because we have already said the cerebellum does not or cannot initiate the muscular movement, but what it does, it coordinates the movement. So if someone has got a lesion in cerebellum, there will be no loss of muscle power, right? But there will be irregular uncoordinated movement. So the movement will not be regular or will not be balanced. Why? Because we have removed that component of the brain that was helping us to balance the movement or to coordinate these movements. So let's dive now into the neuroanatomy of cerebellum, and let's start with anatomy of the cerebellum. So if you see from the top, from the superior view, the cerebellum is a butterfly shaped, and as a butterfly, it has got the body of the butterfly and the wings. So this might be the left wing and this the right wing, but this one is the body of the butterfly. So same applies. This body of the butterfly is the cerebellar vermis. It's vermis. Vermis means worm. So it's like a worm. So this body of the vermis is like the worm. The body of the cerebellum is known as vermis, which literally means the worm. Now the lateral wings of the cerebellum, the lateral wings of this butterfly will form the cerebellar hemisphere. So we have left cerebellar hemisphere, and this is right cerebellar hemisphere. So left cerebellar hemisphere, right cerebellar hemisphere, they are connected by the vermis. So when you flip it upside down, it looks like this structure here. So it is still the butterfly shaped, but you see that the vermis is not continuous on the inferior surface. So it's like it comes in this direction and it curves downward. And it terminates as a nodule. So I want you to note that this nodule is it is a part of vermis. So it is the most inferior end of the vermis. So it's like the most caudal end of the vermis. So the most caudal end of the vermis is known as the nodule. And another thing I want you to note that we have two elevations here. We have elevation on this side, the right side, and elevation on the left side. So these elevations, they are known as flocculus. So we've seen the vermis, which terminates as the nodule, and we've seen the flocculus. So I think basically anatomy, the surface anatomy of the the surface anatomy of the cerebellum is not a problem at all, I think, because this we have just few structures, and then let us add a little bit of structures with already existing. So these are the cerebellum is divided into three lobes. It's three lobes. Number one, we have the anterior lobe. We have the anterior lobe. So this is the anterior lobe. We have posterior lobe. So anterior lobe is separated from posterior lobe by the primary fissure. So this is the primary fissure. You can see here on the left side, and this is the primary fissure on the right side. So primary fissure separates the anterior lobe from posterior lobe. So we have seen two lobes so far, the anterior lobe and posterior lobe. So the anterior lobe is separated from posterior lobe by the primary fissure. But then when you flip it down, now upside down, now the cerebellum, as you have seen from the inferior view or the ventral surface of the cerebellum, you will see that this is anterior lobe. So this is anterior lobe, this is posterior lobe. But on the lateral surface, you can see that this is the posterior lobe, this is anterior lobe. So we can still see that primary fissure on the lateral sides of the inferior view. See, even here you can see. So that was the primary fissure. But remember when we said that you have a vermis here, and the vermis terminates itself to form a nodulus. I think you recall the nodulus of the vermis. So this is the nodulus of the vermis. And we said we had the two elevations here, left and right. So we had elevation on the right side, we had elevation on the left side. We call them flocculus. So what if I tell you that these flocculus on either side, they will functionally join together with the nodulus to form the third lobe of the cerebellum, which is known as flocculonodular lobe. I said, remember we had the vermis, and the vermis terminated itself as the nodulus. And we had two elevations on either side of the cerebellum. So we said we had a flocculus here and another flocculus here. So these three structures, two flocculi and one nodulus, they will join together functionally to form a third lobe of the cerebellum, which is known as the flocculonodular lobe. So as we see later, that this flocculonodular lobe is the one that will help to maintain posture and balance and the sense of equilibrium. Right? So to maintain posture and balance and the sense of equilibrium, that will be performed by the flocculonodular lobe. We have seen anterior lobe and posterior lobe, and now the third lobe of the cerebellum is known as the flocculonodular lobe. So the flocculonodular lobe is separated from the posterior lobe of the cerebellum by the so-called the posterolateral fissure. The posterolateral fissure will separate the flocculonodular lobe from posterior lobe of the cerebellum. This is just a function. This is just an anatomical classification. This is just the anatomy, the surface anatomy of the cerebellum. We dive into functional organization, but in this surface anatomy, we appreciate that the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe will help to govern some aspects of the movement of skeletal muscles, the anterior and the posterior lobe. But we see, we rarely talk about, this organization of the cerebellum with relation to the function they perform, but we see the function organization of cerebellum in short. So if you flip it upside down, so this is the inferior view. So this is the inferior view of the cerebellum. You see, we have so this will be the right cerebellar hemisphere. This will be the left cerebellar hemisphere, but this will be the ramus. And the ramus, remember, it is not continuous on the ventral surface. It's not continuous on anterior surface or the inferior surface, but it is continuous on the posterior surface. But it terminates, as the nodulus. And remember, we said we had flocculus here. So we have nodulus at the middle, and then we have flocculus on the right side, flocculus on the left side. They are functionally, I want you to note that they are functionally connected. They are not, if you see here, they are not even like, it's not a continuous lobe as we have seen in the previous picture, previous picture that you see here. It is kind of, connected. So this is just pectoral presentation. It is not, they are not connected together, but they are functionally connected. So it turned out that they perform something which is common for both of them. That's why they decided to make it a third lobe of the brain. So flocculus and the nodulus, we together form the flocculo-nodular lobe as the third lobe of the brain, of the cerebellum, sorry. So another important feature to see in this picture, you see it will have a primary fissure here, because this is a posterior lobe, this is anterior lobe, so they are separated by the primary fissure. But this is posterior lobe, this is flocculo-nodular lobe, so they are separated by the posterolateral fissure. So this posterolateral fissure here. Another important thing to note is the inferior, at the very, very, very lower point of the cerebellum, we have something known as tonsils or cerebellar tonsils. So the cerebellar tonsils are the inferior most portions or most parts of the cerebellar hemisphere. So these are very, very, very inferior. They can be, so in case of herniation, in case of something compresses the brain, remember this is the cerebellum is found in the posterior cranial fossa. Cerebellum is found in the posterior cranial fossa. So, and it's just behind the brainstem, which means it's just behind the pons, but the inferior ends extend to the, to the medulla. Now, in case there happens compression within the brain, within the cranial cavity, so it compresses the brain downward, these portions can be compressed. They can inhale through the foramen magnum. So if you hear like someone has got tonsillar herniation, it means the tonsils of the cerebellum inhales through the foramen magnum. It's very common in compression in this space occupying region that will result into compression of the brain. So that was ramus. Then let's dive a bit on the surface here, the internal anatomy. So you see, the cerebellum, just like the cerebral cortex, can be divided into two layers. So we have the outer layer of the cerebellum, the outer layer of the gray matter, which is known as the cerebellar cortex. So this is the cerebellar cortex, and then we have the inner layer of white matter. So the outer layer of the cerebellum is known as the cerebellar cortex. It is a layer of gray matter, and it has convolutions. It has this convolution, just like how the cerebellum had the gyri, but for the case of the cerebellum, we call them the foria. Foria, they literally mean leaves, leaves, majani. So the foria. So these small convolution, they are not gyrus. They are not gyri in the case of cerebellum. So they are foria. These are foria. Okay, and we see now we have the the inner layer of the white matter, which organizes itself in a tree pattern, and this tree pattern is known as the arbor vitae. The arbor vitae translates into the tree of life. Tree of life. So arbor means tree, vitae means life. So that's the Latin. I think we can also appreciate that this is the primary fissure. So this is the anterior lobe, this is posterior lobe, and then this is flocculus. Nodulus. This is nodulus, and we see that beautiful pattern that is known as the arbor vitae. So let's discuss about something known as cerebellum peduncle. So it is no wonder that the cerebellum sits like the backpack of the brainstem. So this is the brainstem, and then this is cerebellum. So it's like the brainstem was put on the backpack. So this is to say that the cerebellum attaches itself to the brainstem. So how does it attach itself to the brainstem? So it has got some feet, like appendages, like the structures that it uses to attach itself to the cerebellum. You remember I don't know, it's those bacteria that use the appendages, to move along here and there, right? Those appendages, we call them the pseudopedia. I don't know, I don't remember. But same applies. So the cerebellum uses these appendages to attach itself to the brainstem. So we literally call them the feet, the feet of the cerebellum. So peduncle means foot. Peduncles means feet. So cerebellar peduncle are literally the feet of the cerebellum. So the cerebellum uses these feet to attach itself to the cerebellum, to the brainstem. The brainstem. So we have three kinds of cerebellar peduncle, or three kinds of feet that are used by the cerebellum to attach itself to the brainstem. Okay, so we have superior cerebellar peduncle, middle cerebellar peduncle, and inferior cerebellar peduncle. So superior cerebellar peduncle, middle cerebellar peduncle, and inferior cerebellar peduncle. Remember, these peduncles, they are just feet, so they are communication. They are attachment of cerebellum to the brainstem. So they're not mere attachment. They attach there, but while they do so, they communicate. So they help communication between cerebellum and the rest of the central nervous system. So they help communication between cerebellum and the rest of the central nervous system. So they are made of white matter. So they are made of white matters. And remember, we already said 1,000 times now that the white matter, they are collection of myelinated axons. The axons with myelin sheath, that the one that form the white matter. So something that is very, 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 very important to note from this slide is that the superior cerebellar peduncle is the main output of the cerebellum. This means if you want to leave the cerebellar system, if you want to move out of cerebellum, away from cerebellum, you will always need to have this superior cerebellar peduncle intact. So you use the superior cerebellar peduncle if you want to move away from the cerebellum. So the moving out of cerebellum, you will always require the superior cerebellar peduncle. But this information they will come from cerebellum through pons. Now you can see this is the region of the pons. So this communication is basically communication between the cerebellum and the pons. But the movement, the information is not limited to pons. The information will go to the red nucleus, the red nucleus of the midbrain and some other parts of the thalamus to even the cerebral cortex. But you cannot forget that superior cerebellar peduncle is meant for output from the cerebellum. So the output from the cerebellum, superior cerebellar peduncle. And we'll have another one here, the middle one. So the middle one is the biggest, it's the largest of these peduncles. The middle cerebellar peduncle is the largest of the three cerebellar peduncle of the three cerebellar feet. And remember, they are all found bilaterally. So what is in the left side, it is also on the right side of the cerebellum. But these two, the two lower cerebellar peduncles, they are main input, so they save in input. If you want to enter into the cerebellar system, you will either enter through the middle cerebellar peduncle or the inferior cerebellar peduncle. It depends on where you come from. But if you want to enter into the cerebellar system or to the cerebellum, you will require one of these two input pathways. So the middle cerebellar peduncle will carry the information from the cerebral cortex. So the information that are coming from the cerebrum through the pons, they will come through middle cerebellar peduncle. And we say most of these the impulse for involuntary movement. Impulse for involuntary movement will come through through the middle cerebellar peduncle. But information from vestibular apparatus and some parts of the cerebellum of the spinal cord will come through the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So vestibular apparatus and proprioception throughout the body. So throughout the body means from the spinal cord, from the peripheral nerves that form the spinal nerves that will bring information to the spinal cord, and then from the spinal cord to the brainstem will come into the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So this is literally says the inferior olivary nucleus that are present in the cerebellum. Present in medulla. The inferior olivary nucleus that is present in the medulla will also take the information or carry the information to the inferior cerebellar peduncle to get into the cerebellum. So these three peduncle are very, very, very important because they help communication between cerebellum and the rest of the central nervous system. They help the communication between cerebellum and the rest of the central nervous system. So you see the vestibular apparatus and the proprioception, they all carry the route through the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So these two are input. The superior cerebellar peduncle is the main output of the three cerebellar peduncles. So let's now dive into the functional classification of cerebellum. Now this is very important because after this one you can explain the symptoms of ataxia and the digital leukokinesia, but only if you pay attention to this particular slide. Now see, some sort of recap. We said we had anterior lobe here. This is anterior lobe, and the anterior lobe. This was posterior lobe. Between the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe, there was primary fissure, as we can see. So that's a primary fissure. This is anterior lobe. This is posterior lobe, and then if you flip it downward, upside down, you will see this is flocculus, this is nodulus, this is flocculus. So they formed the flocculonodular lobe. But that was anatomical classification. And remember, I promised you that we will have the functional classification of the cerebellum. So functional classification of the cerebellum. So cerebellum now can be functionally classified into three zones. You can call them parts. You can call them regions. So 3 functional zones, 3 functional regions, or 3 functional parts. Let's dive into the deep anatomy about it. So you see, you have the body of the butterfly. The body of the butterfly made the vermis of the cerebellum. So this is basically the vermis of the cerebellum. So the very first functional part of the cerebellum is the combination of the vermis and the flocculonodular lobe. So flocculonodular lobe and the vermis, they form the first functional part of the cerebellum. The first functional part of the cerebellum is made up of the vermis together with the flocculonodular lobe. Vermis and flocculonodular lobe, they form the very first part of the cerebellum. Okay, so these vermis and flocculonodular lobe. So vermis per se, it helps in maintaining or coordination of the muscles of the trunk. Guys, the vermis will help to maintain the coordination of muscles of the trunk and the proximal muscles of the rims. Proximal muscles of the rims and muscles of the trunk. Proximal muscles of the rims, they will all be maintained, or they all be coordinated by the vermis. I hope that is clear. I hope it is clear that the vermis controls the proximal muscles, the muscles of the trunk, and proximal muscles of the limbs. And by limbs I mean both upper limbs and lower limbs, but only the proximal muscles are being coordinated by the vermis of the cerebellum. And then the flocculonodular lobe will help to maintain the vestibular system, or the balance and posture, as well as the vestibulo-ocular control. Balance and the vestibulo-ocular control, that is the flocculonodular lobe. So the very first functional part of the cerebellum, it's formed by vermis and the flocculonodular lobe. The vermis controls the muscles of the trunk and the proximal muscles of the ribs. So we have another functional part here, just lateral on either side of the vermis. It is known as the intermediate zones. The intermediate part, or the intermediate region, is just lateral to the vermis on the either side. So this part will help to coordinate the muscles of the distal muscles of the limbs, the distal muscles of the limbs. And by limbs, remember we have upper limbs and lower limbs. So it helps to coordinate the muscles of upper limbs and lower limbs, but only the distal muscles, only the distal muscles of the limbs. And lastly, we have the more lateral parts, the more lateral part on the other side of the cerebellum. It is also known as the lateral part or the lateral hemispheres. The lateral part or the lateral hemispheres. And out of all these function organization or functional classification, the lateral part is the most biggest compared to the rest of the parts. So this lateral part is involved, in planning and planning of the motor programs for the extremities. For the extremities, we will see that there are the reciprocal connection between this lateral part of the lateral part of the cerebellum with association areas of the cerebral cortex. Lateral part of the cerebellum with association area. So it has like kind of higher. It has some higher cognitive functions like acquisition of knowledge because of reciprocal connection between the cerebellum and the cerebral cortex. And this will form, remember I said we have two functional classification. We have two functional classification of the cerebellum. So this is the first classification. We will see another classification that would explain for why the lateral part of the hemisphere, lateral part of the cerebellum will have some higher cognitive function. So this is that other classification that I was talking about, that we had. The first classification we have seen that we have the vermis. Recap: the vermis here, the intermediate zones, and the lateral parts. The vermis together with the vermis here together with the flocculonodular lobe, they made the very first part, flocculonodular lobe and the vermis, the very first part. The second part was the intermediate part on the other side, and the last one was the lateral part. But in this classification now, we will see that it is divided. The cerebellum is divided into all three parts as well, but for this case, we will have the cerebrocerebellum on the lateral side, the cerebrocerebellum. And because I've just said that you have the complex relationship or reciprocal connection between the cerebellum and the cerebral cortex, that might explain for why this part, the lateral part of the cerebellum, helps in a higher cognition or high cognitive function, like acquisition of knowledge. So the second part is this we call the spinal cerebellum. And the last, so this is spinal cerebellum. The spinal cerebellum is made up of the vermis and the intermediate zone. The spinal cerebellum is made up of vermis and the intermediate zone. It forms the spinal cerebellum. Why? I think you can recall that there was communication between cerebellum and the spinal cord, and it made its way through the inferior cerebellar peduncle. And lastly, we have this the other part of the the cerebellum that is known as the vestibulocerebellum. It is called the vestibulocerebellum because of its function in balance and posture. balance and posture. Remember, in the previous classification, this was just supposed to be the flocculonodular lobe that was, taken together with the vermis. But for this case, flocculonodular lobe, which forms the vestibular cerebellum, which helps in balance. So vestibular cerebellum will help in balance. The cerebral cerebellum will deal with higher cognitive function like motor planning. The spinal cerebellum will communicate with the spinal cord. So it forms a complex connection with spinal cord, and it will help, those information like proprioception, the joint position in space will be done by the spinal cerebellum. So summary, the vestibular cerebellum, it gets input from the vestibular system, but the main function is to control the balance and movement of the eyes. And the output, it cases its output into the vestibular nuclei. The vestibular nuclei are found in the brainstem. And then spinal cerebellum, as you see the name spinal, it gets its input from the spinal cord. It maintains the posture, gait, and ongoing limb coordination. But it gives its output through fastigial and interposed nuclei. And lastly, the cerebral cerebellum, you see the names, as the name suggests, that it comes from the cerebellum, the cerebral cortex, and it helps in planning and fine motor control, and it gives its output through the dentate nucleus, and the thalamus. Sorry, there was a camera here. So this is the vestibular cerebellum that carries the vestibular system, and the spinal cerebellum, and that was the cerebral cortex. So let's discuss about the cerebellar cortex. So we said you have two layers of the cerebellum. We have the cerebellar cortex, or the gray matter, the outermost gray matter, and we have the cerebellar white matter, which form the arbor vitae, the tree of life. So if we now discuss the anatomy of the cerebellar cortex, the outermost layer. So the outermost layer is made up of 3 layers of cells. So it has the granular cell layer here, which is made up of granular cells. It has the Purkinje cell layer here, which is made up mainly by the Purkinje cells. This bluish cells, these are the Purkinje cells. And then we have the molecular layer. The molecular layer is the outermost, which has got a lot of cells within it. It has basket cells and the stellate cells, and some terminal axons of these cells, the Morse fibers and stuffs. So we have 3 kind of cell layers in the cerebellar cortex. So we have the granular cell layer, the Purkinje cell layer, and the molecular layer. So many details in this slide, but I want you just to note that so we have the Purkinje cells here. This is the Purkinje cell, and we have 2 main fibers that we want to talk about in this presentation. So we have the Morse fibers. So this is the Morse fiber. The Morse fiber and the climbing fiber is here. So this is the climbing fiber. So these are the main input into the cerebellar cortex. It's not the cerebellum, guys. It is input to the cerebellar cortex, the cortical part of the cerebellum. The cortical part of the cerebellum receives input from the Morse fibers and the climbing fibers. Climbing fibers and Morse fibers. So the Morse fibers will take information into the cerebellar cortex. And when after reaching the cerebellar cortex, it bifurcates into two. For example, if you see this one, it bifurcates into the fiber that goes in this direction and the other one goes into that direction. So it makes like a perpendicular bifurcation. So if it gets into the molecular layer, it divides to form two two terminal branches. But the most important thing is this in this slide is for you to note that the Morse fiber and climbing fiber are the two main input into the cerebellar cortex. Two main input to the cerebellar cortex, and the Purkinje cell is the main output from the cerebellar cortex. It gets output from the cerebellar cortex, and it takes this information into the deep cerebellar nuclei, So it takes the output from cerebellum into deep cerebellar nuclei. I think this is it's kind of simplification of what I've said. Like, okay, so this is cerebellar cortex, and these are the main cells that are found there. So this is the Purkinje cell. There is a basket cell here. It is called a basket cell because it kind of forms like a basket that covers the cell body of the Purkinje cell. So the cell body of the Purkinje cell is being surrounded by the basket cell. I think that's why it is known as the basket cell, because it forms like a basket of the cerebellum to the Purkinje cell. And and we said we had the climbing fiber. So this is the climbing fiber. It is parallel to Purkinje fiber. And we said this case the input to the cerebellar cortex, but this input comes from the inferior olivary nucleus. So the input from inferior olivary nucleus, it comes through the climbing fibers into the cerebellar cortex. And what I was saying is, this Morse fiber, as it terminates, the dendrites from these Morse fibers, they will bifurcate into two. See, it bifurcate. The one branch will go into this direction, and the other branch will go to this direction. Same applies. So they say it kinds of make 90 degrees. The branches from the Morse fibers will form the 90 degrees with respect to the dendrites of the Purkinje. So they are perpendicular to the Purkinje fiber dendrites. So the Purkinje dendrites are in perpendicular direction with respect to the Morse fibers, the dendrites of the Morse fibers. Now, that's not so important to note. What is important to note from this slide is that these two fibers, the climbing fiber and the Morse fiber, they form the input into the cerebellar cortex. And the output from the cerebellar cortex is being relayed by the Purkinje fibers. So Purkinje cells will form the main output, but it is output from the cerebellar cortex to the deep nuclei of the cerebellum. Output from cerebellar cortex to the deep nucleus, because nuclei are the ones which perform all the function of the cells. We already said, because you see, we have a neuron. A neuron is divided into cell body and appendages like dendrites and axons. But it is the function of the neurons, it's the function of the cell body which contains the nucleus that defines the function of the neuron. So we say something, maybe the function of maybe something, some kind of nucleus. eh? It is what performs that function of the cell. It is the nucleus of the cell, which is found in the cell body. So all these informations are taken into the deep nuclei of the cerebellum, because these deep nuclei of the cerebellum are the ones that perform most of these functions. So now let's discuss about this deep nuclei of the cerebellum. So, just as how we saw the deep nuclei of the cerebrum, and we call them the basal ganglia, we have deep nuclei within the cerebellum. So, these nuclei, we have 4 nuclei on either side, and starting from lateral to medial, we have the most lateral nucleus. This one is known as the dentate nucleus. The dentate nucleus is the outermost one, the dentate nucleus, and then it is followed by this second nucleus, which is known as the emboliform nucleus. And then we have two nuclei. Here, 1 and 2. They are called the globus nucleus. And the most medial nucleus is known as the fastigial nucleus. So we have a total of 4 nuclei that are found deep within cerebellum. And from lateral to medial, we had the dentate nucleus here, the outermost. We had the emboliform nucleus. We had the globus nucleus, and lastly the fastigial nucleus. So we've got a mnemonic here that says, do not eat greasy foods. Is a mnemonic for you to memorize, to remember these deep cerebellar nuclei. And remember, they are from lateral to medial. So this is the dentate nucleus, emboliform nucleus, the globus nucleus, and the fastigial nucleus. So the two middle nuclei, which is emboliform and the globus nucleus, they are together referred to as interposed nucleus or interposed nuclei. These two, the globus as well as the emboliform, they make the so-called the interposed nucleus. And remember, as I've already said, they are called nuclei because they are found within the central nervous system. Correction of neuronal cell bodies within the central nervous system, is what makes something to be called a nucleus. So they are deep, and these are the functional unit of the cells that they perform whatever function that we say. So if we say that the cerebellum helps in coordination of the movement, is actually these nuclei that coordinate the movement. So whatever function that is being carried by a specific, whatever function of the brain you are referring to the gray matters, the neuronal cell bodies that perform this function. So those are, now we have said the Purkinje cells will take the output from the cerebellar cortex into the deep cerebellar nuclei. So all those output from the cerebellar cortex will come into the deep cerebellar nuclei, and then from the deep cerebellar nuclei, this information can be taken into the other parts of the central nervous system. And remember, the superior cerebellar peduncle was the main output from the cerebellum. So this is to say that the information from these deep cerebellar nuclei will then be taken by the superior cerebellar peduncle into other parts of the brain. Now I want you now to connect. Sorry. I want you to connect that. I want you to connect that. Remember, we had this functional classification of the cerebellum, then the vermis, the intermediate parts, and the lateral part. So I want you to connect with the nuclei that are found deep within the cerebellum. Okay, so in summary, the most lateral nucleus, which is the dentate nucleus, will send its information to the lateral. So the most lateral nucleus, which is the dentate nucleus here, will communicate with the lateral part of the cerebellum. So it's like it receives its information from the lateral part, because we said the information was taken from wherever it came from into the cerebellar cortex, and then from cerebellar cortex it used the Purkinje fibers or Purkinje cells to get into the deep cerebellar nuclei. So the information from the lateral cortex will gain its access, will use the Purkinje fiber to come to the dentate nucleus, the most lateral nucleus. So the most lateral part will project into a most lateral nucleus, which is the dentate nucleus. So this is to say, if we said like, okay, the lateral part, the function of the lateral part was to coordination and the motor plans, coordination of the motor plans, we mean that the function of the dentate nucleus will also be the same. In other words, if you have damage in the dentate nucleus, we will have the symptoms that correspond to the symptoms of the damage of this lateral part of the cerebellum. Same applies. The two now interposed nuclei, which is the emboliform and the globus nucleus. The emboliform and the globus nucleus, they will receive the information from the intermediate parts. So the information from the intermediate cerebellar cortex will project into the interposed nuclei, and together will help to do the function that we originally said. The function that we originally said was performed by the intermediate part. And what was it again? The intermediate part helped to maintain the muscles of, the distal muscles of the limbs. So if we have damage to these two nuclei, the interposed nuclei will have the same presentation as with someone with damage on the intermediate part. And lastly, the most medial nucleus, which is fastigial nucleus, it is found, it receives information from the vermis of the cerebellum. And remember, the vermis of cerebellum, it helped to maintain to coordinate the muscles of the trunk and the proximal muscles of the limbs. So if we have damage into this nucleus, fastigial nucleus, the symptoms will be the same as if you have damage to this part or the vermis of the cerebellum. So guys, I think it makes a lot of sense if we said this nuclei. We form the, we communicate with this, functional parts of the cerebellum. And as we have said, we have some, vestibular nuclei, which are not located within the cerebellum, but they work together. They are located in the brainstem, but they work together in as additional deep cerebellar nuclei, because they function in same way as these two nuclei, and they help in maintaining balance and posture. So let's have summary on the input to the cerebellum. And we have already said that all the input to the cerebellum will do so by using the inferior or middle cerebellar peduncle. So if you have to enter into cerebellar system, you will have to use either middle cerebellar peduncle or inferior cerebellar peduncle, middle cerebellar peduncle or inferior cerebellar peduncle. But let's see now, those are the input that were entering the cerebellar system, but where do they come from? That's another question. So let's see most of these inputs to the cerebellum. So we have input from the cerebral cortex or the forebrain. We have input from the spinal cord or the rest of the body. We have inputs from the vestibular system and the brainstem. So these are the main input to the cerebellum. So we have the input from the cerebral cortex, the cortical input. We have input from the spinal cord. We have input from brainstem, red nucleus also is found in the brainstem and spinal cord, and we also have input from the vestibular system. Now let's break it down. So input from cerebellum will use the pontocerebellar fibers. These are the fibers that originate, like connect pons and cerebellum. So the pontocerebellar fibers will take the input from the cerebral cortex. This is just for simplification. It was supposed to mention here that it comes from the cerebral cortex, but they said the pons, but the pons is like a bridge. It really means the bridge, so it's kind of it's a pathway that the fiber can information can take to reach into different parts of the brain. So the information here will come from cerebral cortex through the pons to the cerebellum. So that's why it's called the pontocerebellar fibers. But we also have the input from cerebellum, from spinal cord. So input from spinal cord will use the spinal cerebellar pathways. Don't worry about these pathways at this moment. Don't worry. Don't spend much time to memorize this. You just know that you have input from the spinal cord, and they use the spinal cerebellar pathways, and this input will help to locate our organs in space. So the proprioception, the sense of position of joints. So the position of joint from the legs, arms, and legs and arms in space. So that is spinal cerebellar pathways. But also we have the input now from the red nucleus. We have the climbing fibers, and the climbing fibers will take the information from the red nucleus, from the cortex, brainstem, and the spinal cord, but they all go through the middle or inferior cerebellar peduncle to get into the cerebellum. And lastly, we can have inputs from vestibular system, the vestibular system that helps to control balance and posture. So now let's discuss about the output. What are the output pathways from the cerebellum? What are the output pathways from the cerebellum? What are the output pathways? So now we've already seen that most of output will use the superior cerebellar peduncle to leave the cerebellar system. Superior cerebellar peduncle will be used to leave the cerebellar system. But it is broken down now into the specific pathways, but they all have something in common. Now look here. So the information now, we said we had the cerebellar cortex that will give information to the will give information into the deep nuclei, and then from deep nuclei they will be carried into other parts of the body. So number one, so the information from the lateral part, the lateral hemisphere, will come into the deep into the dentate nucleus, and then from dentate nucleus the information will be carried by the superior cerebellar peduncle into the red nucleus and the motor and the cortical area of the brain, but of the contralateral side. I want you to note this, that we have the dentate nucleus. The dentate nucleus will carry the information from, the dentate nucleus will send the information through the superior cerebellar peduncle into the, the red nucleus of the contralateral side. So the contralateral nucleus and the, contralateral cortical areas of the cerebellum, sorry. So this is to say this information from superior cerebellar peduncle will cross the midline, so they form like a decussation. So there will be a decussation of the superior cerebellar peduncle fibers into the contralateral side of the brain. Are we together? So again, so the information now from the fibers, the fiber that crossed into the contralateral side, now we will descend through different motor fibers, but when it reaches the level of the pyramid, these fibers will again decussate to the contralateral side. What is this? This is the double decussation of the cerebellum. It's a double decussation of cerebellum. Note, we saw that the information from the right side of the cerebellar cortex have crossed the midline into the left side of the cerebellum, and then from the cerebrum now, or this side, whether it's this one or this, doesn't matter. So information from now cerebellum will descend as it moves through the spinal cord, through the brainstem, but when it reaches the level of the pyramid, they decussate again to go back to the original side of the cerebellum. So this double decussation, we see it explains for ipsilaterality of the cerebellum. Why? Because these fibers crossed the midline 2 times. So it went and then it came back. So we see that is ipsilaterality. So we have something that is known as the superior cerebellar peduncle decussation. So decussation at the superior cerebellar peduncle, and as we can see here, this superior cerebellar peduncle will decussate into the contralateral side of the cerebral hemisphere. So that was number 1. Number 2, they have something in common actually. So we can see that the information from interposed nucleus. The first one was the information from the dentate nucleus, but now the information from the interposed nucleus will also use the superior cerebellar peduncle to decussate into the contralateral side, and then from the contralateral side the information will go down, but at the level of the pyramid, of decussation, the fibers will again to cross back into the into the same side of the cerebellum. So this is also explains the ipsilaterality of the cerebellum. So this is why we were saying, like, if you have a damage into the left side of the cerebellum, the lesions or the symptoms will be seen on the same side of the body. So right for the right cerebellum peduncle, for the right cerebellar hemisphere, left for the left cerebellar hemisphere. And then lastly, I think they have something in common, and don't worry, and this from the vestibular nucleus again, the information from the vestibular nucleus and the fastigial nucleus. They will also cross through the superior cerebellar peduncle into the contralateral side. So it also explains for the ipsi laterality of the cerebellum. Ipsi laterality for the cerebellum. So now I think you can answer the question for why do we have the ipsilaterality of the cerebellum? Like why do we why when someone has got a region on the left side of the cerebellum, the symptoms appears on the same side of the body? That is because of the ipsilaterality. So these are the main output, but don't worry about this output. You just have to appreciate that all these output, they come through superior cerebellar peduncle. But I think that's the important thing, and we have already associated the regions with the nuclei. So the lateral hemisphere will project into the dentate nucleus, the intermediate hemisphere will project into interposed nucleus, and the vermis will project into the fastigial nucleus. The inferior portion of the vermis and the flocculonodular lobe will project into the into the vestibular nuclei, which are found within the brain